I've worked the night shift at Disneyland for almost 5 years now, mainly on Main Street, USA. It's the heart of the park, the first thing guests see when they walk in and the last when they leave. During the day, it's all smiles and magic. But at night, when the crowds are gone and the lights dim, it takes on a different atmosphere. One evening, after the park had closed and most of the staff had left, I was tasked with cleaning the Emporium. It's a large store, packed with souvenirs, plush toys, and Disney memorabilia. Normally, it's a relaxing job, with the ambient music still playing softly over the speakers and the distant sounds of the park settling for the night. But on this particular night, something felt different. As I pushed my cleaning cart down the aisles, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I've felt that before in other parts of the park, but this was different. This was intense. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and every creak of the building made me jump. I tried to ignore it, focusing on my work. I was halfway through sweeping the main aisle when I heard it. A faint, distant sound, like a child's laughter. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. The park was supposed to be empty. No guests, no children, just a few cast members finishing their shifts. I listened, straining to catch the sound again, but all I heard was the soft hum of the air conditioning and the quiet music playing overhead. I told myself it was just my imagination, the product of too many late nights and too many ghost stories passed around by my coworkers. But then I heard it again, clearer this time, coming from somewhere deeper in the store. It was definitely a child's laughter, light and carefree, like the kind you'd hear during the day when the park was full of families. I felt a chill run down my spine. I knew I had to check it out, even though every instinct was screaming at me to leave. I grabbed my flashlight and headed toward the sound, weaving my way through the displays and shelves. The laughter grew louder as I approached the back of the store, near the old employee access door that led to the storage area. The door was slightly ajar, and a faint light was spilling out from inside. I pushed the door open slowly, the hinges creaking in the silence. The storage room was dimly lit by a single flickering bulb, casting long, eerie shadows across the floor. The shelves were lined with boxes of merchandise, and there was an old display case pushed against the far wall, covered in dust. But what caught my attention was the figure standing in the center of the room. It was a little girl, maybe 6 or 7 years old, dressed in an old-fashioned white dress that looked like something out of the early 1900s. Her hair was dark and neatly braided, and she was holding a small stuffed Mickey Mouse toy in her hands. She didn't seem to notice me at first. Her attention focused on the toy. She was humming softly to herself, a tune I couldn't quite place, but that sounded strangely familiar. My heart was pounding in my chest as I took a cautious step forward. "Hey, are you lost?" I asked, my voice shaking slightly. The girl looked up at me, and I felt my blood run cold. Her eyes were hollow, empty voids that seemed to swallow the light. Her face was pale, almost translucent, and there was an unnatural stillness to her, like she wasn't really there. For a moment, we just stared at each other, neither of us moving. Then, slowly, she smiled, a wide, unsettling grin that didn't reach her eyes. "I'm not lost," she said in a voice that was both childlike and eerily calm. "I'm waiting." "Waiting for what?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "For the show," she replied, her smile never wavering. I took a step back, my hand trembling as I tightened my grip on the flashlight. The air in the room felt heavy, oppressive, and I could feel a cold sweat forming on the back of my neck. Suddenly, the lights in the storage room flickered and went out, plunging the room into darkness. I fumbled with my flashlight, switching it on and sweeping the beam across the room. The girl was gone, but I could still hear her laughter, echoing around me, bouncing off the walls. Panic set in, and I bolted out of the storage room, my heart racing. I didn't stop running until I was back in the main store, the bright lights and cheerful music a stark contrast to the darkness I had just left behind. I reported what I had seen to my supervisor, but they brushed it off as stress and exhaustion. Maybe they were right, but I know what I saw, and I know that little girl was not just a figment of my imagination. I never worked the night shift alone again, and I avoided the Emporium whenever I could. But even now, whenever I walk down Main Street, I can't help but feel like I'm being watched, like that little girl is still there, waiting for her show to start.
Working the night shift at Disneyland had its perks, but it also had its downsides. I'd been assigned to clean Walt Disney's private office, a room that had been kept exactly as he left it. I'd heard stories about the place, how some employees felt uneasy in there, but I shrugged it off. It was just another job, I told myself. The first time I stepped into the office, though, I felt it immediately. The air was different, heavier. The silence in the room was almost tangible, pressing down on me as I began dusting the desk. That's when I noticed it. A vintage phone, pristine and untouched, began to ring softly. At first I thought it was my imagination, but the sound was real, growing louder, more insistent. I picked up the receiver, not expecting anything more than a dial tone, but what I heard froze the blood in my veins. A voice, deep, authoritative, and unmistakably Walt Disney's, came through. "You shouldn't be here," the voice said, calm but firm. I dropped the receiver in shock, but instead of hitting the floor, it hovered in the air, as if held by invisible hands. Slowly, it placed itself back on the hook, and I felt a surge of panic. I bolted out of the office, heart racing, swearing I'd never set foot in there again. But the next night, I found myself standing outside that same door, my hand on the knob. I didn't want to go in, but something compelled me, an invisible force drawing me back. The moment I stepped inside, the temperature plummeted, my breath visible in the freezing air. The room was different this time, bathed in an eerie, unnatural light. Shadows moved across the walls, and I could hear faint whispers, growing louder with each passing second. The phone rang again, and despite every instinct screaming at me to leave, I answered. "I told you not to come back," the voice hissed, now distorted and filled with anger. The lights flickered, and when they came back on, I saw him, Walt Disney, standing behind the desk. But it wasn't the kindly face I'd seen in pictures. His eyes were hollow, dark voids that bore into me. "You've disturbed my sanctuary," he said, stepping closer. I tried to back away, but I couldn't move, my feet rooted to the spot. The walls began to close in, the room shrinking around me. The whispers became a deafening roar, accusing voices condemning me for intruding. I couldn't breathe, my vision blurring as the walls pressed tighter, suffocating me. The last thing I saw was Walt's ghost, looming over me, his lips curling into an eerie smile as he whispered, "Now you'll never leave." The next morning, they found me in the office, lifeless, my face frozen in a mask of terror. They said it was a heart attack, but I knew the truth. Walt's spirit had claimed me, punishing me for disturbing his eternal rest.
Disneyland had always been my happy place, but there was one ride I'd never dared to visit. The old, abandoned attraction hidden deep in the park. It was one of Walt Disney's original ideas, or so they said, but it never opened to the public. Instead, it was left to decay, locked away behind rusty gates and overgrown vines. One evening, my friends and I decided to explore it. We found a gap in the fence, squeezed through, and entered the forgotten section of Disneyland. The air was thick with the smell of decay, the ground littered with debris from the neglected ride. The entrance was covered in rust, the name of the attraction faded and unreadable. But something about the place drew me in, an urge I couldn't explain. We pried open the doors and stepped into the dark interior. The ride was unlike anything I'd ever seen. A maze of twisted tracks and bizarre animatronics, their eyes following us as we walked by. The air was stale, carrying the scent of mold and something far worse. As we ventured deeper, the atmosphere grew heavier, more oppressive. The animatronics began to move, their eyes glowing with a malevolent light. The ride's mechanisms creaked to life, gears grinding loudly in the silence. My friends wanted to leave, but I couldn't pull myself away. The ride seemed alive, as if it had been waiting for us, for me to bring it back from the dead. Suddenly, the cars began to move on their own, separating me from my friends. The ride's narrative twisted into something dark, a far cry from Disneyland's usual charm. It was the story of a lost soul, trapped in a nightmare of their own making. I was whisked through dark, winding tunnels, the animatronics reaching out with cold, clammy hands. The line between reality and the ride blurred, and I felt myself slipping, losing track of what was real and what wasn't. The final scene of the ride was a mirror, reflecting my terrified face. But something was wrong. My reflection was smiling, an eerie, twisted grin that didn't match my own expression. The mirror shattered, plunging me into darkness. When the ride finally stopped, I was alone. My friends were gone, and the exit led me back to the same rusted entrance. I ran, desperate to escape, but when I returned to the park, I realized something horrifying. Time had passed. The sun was rising, but it wasn't the same day. My friends had been searching for me for days, but I had no memory of where I'd been or what had happened inside the ride. The only thing I knew was that I was different. Something had followed me out, something dark and twisted, and it wasn't going to let me go.
I've always been drawn to the Haunted Mansion at Disneyland. The ride is the perfect blend of eerie atmosphere and fun scares. But I'd heard whispers that there was more to it than just the ride. Some said the mansion was actually haunted, that the spirits of those who had died in the park lingered there, trapped between worlds. One night, I decided to find out for myself. I stayed behind after the park closed, hiding until the last of the guests had left. Once the coast was clear, I made my way to the haunted mansion, my heart pounding with a mix of excitement and fear. As I stepped inside, the usual playful atmosphere seemed to shift, growing darker, more oppressive. The air felt thick, and every creak of the floorboards echoed like a warning. I reached the attic scene where the ghostly bride stood, her face hidden under a veil. But as I approached, I noticed something odd. The figure wasn't animatronic. It moved too smoothly, too naturally. The bride turned to face me, and my blood ran cold as she lifted her veil. Her face was pale, her eyes hollow, and her smile, oh God, her smile, was twisted in a way that no human face should be. She reached out to me, and I stumbled back, tripping over something on the floor. When I looked down, I saw a dusty old photograph, a wedding picture of the bride, her eyes crossed out with red ink. I picked up the photo, and suddenly, the mansion seemed to come alive. The ghosts that had been mere illusions were now solid, real, and they were watching me. The walls began to close in, the air growing colder with each passing second. I tried to retrace my steps, but the mansion's layout had changed. The corridors twisted and turned in ways that defied logic, leading me deeper into the darkness. The ghostly bride followed me, her laughter echoing off the walls, a sound that was both beautiful and terrifying. I found myself in the grand ballroom, where the ghostly dance was in full swing. But the dancers weren't harmless projections. They were real, and their eyes were full of malice. The chandelier above began to sway, casting eerie shadows that danced along with the spirits. The bride appeared beside me, whispering in my ear, her breath cold against my skin. "Stay with us," she cooed, her voice sweet but laced with something sinister. "We've been waiting for you." I tried to run, but the ghosts surrounded me, their cold hands gripping my arms, my legs, pulling me down. The last thing I saw was the bride, her face inches from mine, as she whispered, "Welcome to the family." When the park opened the next morning, I was gone. They searched the mansion, but there was no sign of me. The only clue left behind was the old photograph, now covered in dust, as though it had been there for decades. I had joined the other ghosts in the mansion, trapped forever in a world between life and death, where the lines of reality are blurred, and the only escape is through the haunted halls of Disneyland's darkest secret.
I've worked at Disneyland for over 10 years, mostly as a ride operator. And I've seen some strange things. Pranks, accidents, guests getting a little too into character. But nothing prepared me for what happened last summer. It was a typical day, and I was operating the Haunted Mansion ride, guiding guests into the doom buggies. Everything was routine until I noticed a woman in an old-fashioned black dress, something straight out of the 1800s, standing near the entrance. I assumed she was a cast member I hadn't met, part of some new attraction or event. She caught my eye and smiled, but the smile didn't reach her eyes. Before I could ask who she was, she disappeared into the crowd. I didn't think much of it, since Disneyland always has something new going on. That night after closing, I was tasked with checking the ride one last time. The park was empty, and as I walked through the Haunted Mansion, I felt a prickling sensation on the back of my neck, like I was being watched. I brushed it off as the natural creepiness of the ride. But then I saw her again, the woman in black, standing in the hallway, motionless. My heart skipped a beat. "Ma'am, the park is closed," I said, but she didn't move. I approached cautiously, reaching for my radio. But as I got closer, I realized something was very wrong. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and there was a chill radiating from her. "Ma'am," I repeated, my voice barely a whisper. She turned slowly to face me, her eyes empty, hollow voids. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out, only a soft, mournful wail that filled the hallway. My blood ran cold. I stumbled backward, dropping my radio. The woman in black glided toward me, her feet not touching the ground, her eyes locked onto mine. I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. Then, as quickly as she appeared, she vanished, leaving behind only the lingering coldness and an oppressive silence. I bolted out of the mansion, heart pounding. I reported the incident to my supervisor, but they dismissed it as a lost guest or a prank. But I knew what I saw. A few days later, I was back at work, but I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. I started asking around, talking to some of the older employees, and learned about a network of old, abandoned tunnels beneath Disneyland, remnants from when the park was first built. According to legend, one of those tunnels runs directly beneath the Haunted Mansion, where the woman in black was first seen. Years ago, when the park was still under construction, a worker got lost in the tunnels and never came back. His body was never found, but strange things started happening in the mansion soon after. Some say the woman in black is his widow, searching for her lost husband. Others believe she's something much darker. I couldn't get her out of my mind. I started having nightmares about her, waking up in a cold sweat, her hollow eyes haunting me. I began to dread going to work, afraid of seeing her again. One night, after the park had closed, I decided to investigate. I made my way to the Haunted Mansion, the air thick with tension. I slipped inside and headed to the area where I'd seen her. The coldness returned as I approached. That same bone-chilling cold that seemed to suck the warmth from the air. Then I saw it. The entrance to the tunnel, hidden behind a section of wall barely noticeable. The door was slightly ajar, a faint, flickering light emanating from within. Against my better judgment, I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The air was damp and musty, the walls lined with crumbling brick. The tunnel stretched out before me, winding deeper into the darkness. I walked for what felt like an eternity, the light from my flashlight casting long, eerie shadows on the walls. The further I went, the colder it became, and the sense of unease grew stronger. I could feel her presence, like she was watching me, waiting for me. Then, I heard it, the sound of footsteps echoing through the tunnel. I froze, my heart pounding. The footsteps grew louder, closer, but I couldn't see anyone. My flashlight flickered and the tunnel was plunged into darkness. Panic set in. I fumbled with the flashlight, trying to get it to work, but it was no use. I was alone in the dark, with only the sound of those footsteps growing ever closer. And then, out of the darkness, I saw her. The woman in black, her eyes glowing with an unnatural light, her face twisted in a grotesque smile. She reached out to me, her fingers cold as ice, and I felt a wave of despair wash over me, like she was draining the very life from my soul. I don't know how I got out of there. The next thing I remember, I was outside the mansion, gasping for breath, my hands trembling. I never went back to the haunted mansion after that, and I transferred to a different part of the park. But the nightmares haven't stopped, and I can still feel her presence, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the next unfortunate soul to cross her path.